So I've been asked to speak today about China's new president, Xi Jinping. We'll still call him president for now. By the end of the talk, you can tell me whether you think the better title is president, dictator, you can decide. What I wanted to do was I wanted to talk a little bit. Actually, I'll go ahead and put this up. I wanted to talk a little bit about who he is and how we can try to understand what policies he wants, what his intentions are for China. He's a really difficult person to understand. So I was just in China for most of the summer, this summer, and there were a lot of policies that he's pursuing that I found myself saying, you know, I really don't think that this is good for China. So for example, a friend of mine who's a local government official, she said that every week they have to go to meetings, they have to study Xi Jinping's writings about government, and they have to write essays. And she confided to me that she buys hers online and just turns them in, and that this is a common practice. So, you know, as a professor, of course, I did not encourage that, but there are things like that. But then there are also things that I find to be really good policies that I think are really good for China. And maybe this is the problem with a dictator, right? Depending on how they act, they can do really great things. They can also do really bad things. And so some of the things that he's doing that I think maybe are really good for China is that, for example, one of the places that I go a lot with my research is called Yunnan province. It's all the way in the southwestern part of China, and it's really beautiful. There's a lot of biodiversity. There's also 24 different minority groups that live there. So there's just a lot of diversity, and it's a really beautiful place. And a lot of people like to vacation there. And so it was being developed very quickly. When Xi Jinping went to visit the area in 2015, he took pictures everywhere he went, and he said to the local government officials, when I come back, I want this to look exactly the same. And basically what happened then is every single one of those really large-scale, ugly development projects, they all stopped, because what he basically said was, I want you to conserve and not develop. So again, you'll have to make your own judgment about who you think he is and whether he's good for China or not. But what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what he was facing when he came to power in 2012. So the China that he was looking at, what kinds of problems and challenges did he face? And we'll try to get a sense for how he understood those challenges. And then we'll look a little bit about what his solutions were. So he approached these problems from a certain perspective, and then he undertook certain solutions. And then we can try to evaluate these to say, are these good for China, or are these not good for China? And then I'd like to try to talk a little bit about intentions as much as we can understand somebody else's intentions. Xi Jinping and I are not friends, so he does not confide in me. So we basically have to try to figure out what his intentions are from what he says and what he does. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we can also talk about some of the consequences. So is he good for China, or is he not good for China? Okay? So to start with, in 2012, when Xi Jinping takes over, so he takes over both the presidency and as General Party Secretary for the Communist Party from Hu Jintao. He also takes over as the Commander-in-Chief of the military forces. So he has all three of these roles then in 2012, meaning that he's responsible for the military, he's responsible for the country, and he's also responsible for the party. So he has three roles at once, which is a little bit different from our country, where the president's responsible for the country and the military, usually not so much the party, right? And so he has a little bit different function in that he has to care about the party as well. So, and the sign over there simply says, China's dream is my dream, right? So this idea that there isn't a lot of daylight in between the concept of the country, the military, and the party, that these things are kind of seen as all together. So one thing that he saw was that the Communist Party, which used to be a really, really large, powerful enterprise, had really lost a lot of its power. So because there was a private marketplace, a lot of people, when they graduated from college, they didn't want to go into the party. They wanted to get a job with Lenovo or Xiaomi or one of these really, really large multinational Chinese firms, or a really large US firm that's, you know, now in China, like Motorola. So for most people, they didn't want to join the party. And if you would ask young people why they weren't joining the party, they said, well, what's the point? The party doesn't do anything anymore, right? So it's my grandfather's party. It was really active in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, but you know, it sort of lost its relevance beginning in the 80s. And so you basically saw a party that was withering away. So it still had a certain amount of membership, but if you looked at the youth membership, people who were choosing to join the party, this was stagnating and declining. And so this is something that Xi Jinping was very concerned about. So remember, he's the general party secretary, and he wants to leave behind a party that's at least as vigorous as when he takes office. So that's one thing he's really concerned about. How does he revitalize the party and make it seem meaningful again to young people? The other thing that he's very concerned about, and this is a really large problem facing China, is basically this idea of a middle income trap. And I'll talk a little bit more about this so that you know exactly what problem we're looking at. But basically, this is something that you've seen in your lifetime. So you saw the rise of China. And so it used to be that everything, including iPhones, right? If you turned it over, it would say made in China. And so everything that we purchased was made in China. It was the workshop of the world. But this is no longer true. So you've probably noticed this already. A lot of things that you purchase, when you turn it over and look at the bottom, it says made in Vietnam, made in Indonesia, made in Ethiopia, right? And so China is no longer the workshop of the world. And in fact, they do a lot of outsourcing. So some of the things that still say made in China are actually produced in their factories in Ethiopia and then shipped over to China for final assembly. Similar to the role that the US plays with a lot of our products, right? So we're the end of the supply chain. And so this is what's happening to China. It's no longer the workshop of the world, but that's an entirely different economy. So if you're the workshop of the world, you have an economy that's full of factories. You don't need people with any skills. You take these people, you put them in factories, and they just work on assembly lines. And that's what you need. Well, if that's no longer your position in the global economy, and now you have to become something else, they're looking to Japan and South Korea and other countries that have done this. So some of you remember where you used to turn things over and it would say made in Taiwan or made in Japan, right? And so that's what China's looking at. They're saying, okay, we have to take that step from being the person who produces plastic toys to being the person who produces semiconductors. So one of the largest things that China's investing in right now is artificial intelligence, and they're also investing a lot in blockchain. That's where they want to be in the future. But as you all know, that's not an easy thing to do, to take an economy and say, okay, here's where we are now, here's where we want to be in the future, so let's get there. That's actually a really, really large trap that a lot of countries fall into and they never get out of, and they never really regain economic growth. So this is what Xi Jinping then inherits, is an economy that's no longer what it used to be, but they don't know exactly how to get to where they're going next, right? So that's one of his concerns. The other is the fact that China's seeing a lot of demographic change. So China has a rapidly graying population. So it's one of the fastest aging populations in the world. The problem is unlike Europe or unlike Japan, who went through the same, or well, Europe's actually still going through this problem, right? This is something that Japan went through in the 80s. These countries were very wealthy when they went through this problem, and so they were able to extend social services to the elderly and still have a strong economy. The problem for China is that it's still a very poor country. So if you leave the eastern seaboard and you move inland, you'll come to places that still don't have electricity, places that still aren't connected to any sort of sanitation, places that really need to be developed, right? They're not very developed. So the problem for China is that unlike any other country in the world, they have a really large aging population that's poor. So that's a different kind of challenge than you face if you're a rich country with an aging population. And so that's another thing then that Xi Jinping has to face. So they still have a lot of economic migrants. These are the people coming from the countryside into the cities to work. But a lot of those migrants are older, they have families, they're not willing to work in the same kind of low-paid, high-risk high-risk jobs that previous migrants were. And in fact, there are a lot of government officials in China who complain that migrants are too good for factory jobs these days. And so it's just a changing demographic. So this is something else that he faces. We also see that the state-owned enterprises in China, they're still very strong. So state-owned enterprises, these are the largest companies in China, and they're usually in heavy industry and utilities like oil and gas. They're still really large and really powerful, but they're heavily in debt. So for a while in the 1990s and the early 2000s, they were buying real estate up around the world. They were buying other companies. You probably heard about a lot of Chinese mergers. So they took on an incredible amount of debt, and now those companies aren't doing that well, but they still have all of that debt. And so this is something that Xi Jinping is also concerned about the strength of the economy if every company that's a large employer is so leveraged. So that's something he's very concerned about. And then the last thing that he's very concerned about is local government. And you might have heard in the news about the anti-corruption campaigns. So these are really focused mostly on local government. So the problem with China is the exact same problem that President Trump would tell you about if you asked him about governing the United States. So President Trump has an immigration policy, and then you have these sanctuary cities or sanctuary states. Now, these sanctuary cities and sanctuary states are basically saying to the government, we're not going to follow your rules, right? And so this is the same kind of deviance that we see in China, where you see the federal government saying one thing and passing a law, and then each local government deciding whether they will or will not follow that law. That's a hard place to govern. So any big country like that, it becomes really difficult to pass something in the capital city and then make sure every single village and township across the entire country passes that law and enforces it in exactly the same way. So this is a challenge then that Xi Jinping has run into, which is that he's concerned about local government debt, he's concerned about the environment, like the story that I told you about Yunnan, and he's also worried about corruption. But he doesn't really have very many ways to force local government officials to do what he wants them to do. So this is the other challenge that he faces. If he needs to do really big things in order to change China, can he really do it? Even if he passes the laws, it doesn't mean that he can enforce the laws. So this is what he inherits then in 2012. This is the country that he receives. And so one thing that I want to talk about very quickly before we move on to his response, just to make sure that you understand it, is this idea of a middle income trap. So for a middle income trap, basically what you're looking at is you're looking at a working age population that is either staying stagnant, the same size, or declining. So you have a smaller population that's working. Because of this, what you see, if you look at China's line right here, is you see that wages are increasing. So what this does then is it drives all of the companies that used to outsource to China, it drives them to cheaper places like Vietnam, Indonesia, these other places that companies are moving to. So if you are a company and you're thinking, where do I want to outsource to? Probably Malaysia and China are not good choices right now, right? But Thailand, Indonesia, or the Philippines, these are some good choices. And so this middle income trap then that you're seeing that China is in is that they have a population, a working age population that's smaller than before, charging more than before. And so they're in this position where they can no longer use that low wage manufacturing model, and they have to find something new. But that something new is really difficult. If everyone could find it, everyone would be a manufacturing powerhouse. It's really hard to become Germany, right? And so this is the problem that China's facing, which is how do they get from where they were to Germany without having their economy collapse? So we've seen rapidly slowing growth already, right? So from 10% down to 6 or 7%, which is still really fast. You know, coming from a country where 2 to 3% is really good, I'm not complaining about 6 or 7%, but it's dramatically slower for China. And if you think about all those indebted local governments and all those indebted state-owned enterprises, they need to keep the economic engine churning if they want to make sure that they don't have any big problems. So this is a concern then. So what Xi Jinping comes up with then is this idea of what he calls, it's translated different ways. Some people call it the China dream and some people call it the Chinese dream. So it sounds a little bit more like the American dream. And this is a quote directly from the speech where he sort of unveiled this concept, but you can see he uses this word that he wants the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And the reason that he wants this is to achieve prosperity, rejuvenation of the nation, and its people's happiness. Now, you can say that sounds really great. So if you're Swedish talking about people's happiness, maybe people know what that means. But what does that mean in China? And that's a good question, because local government officials now are being required to evaluate people's happiness to see if they're doing a good job. And they're not quite sure how to do that either. But this is basically his goal. And so this is what he would like to achieve. And so one of the problems then is that you have this local corruption, and it's very tightly tied to government power. So if you translate this title up here, Guan means local government official, and Ardai means second generation. So what you're looking at, this is the last administration in China, and if you see what their children are doing or their spouses, what you can see is that if you're a government official in China, you have all of these access channels to getting incredible amounts of wealth, right? So Xi Jinping's son went to Harvard. I believe his daughter did as well, and he paid out of pocket for both of these. Now, if you know what a local government official in China is supposed to make, that is impossible, right? And his wife is a folk singer, and people like folk singing, but you don't usually become a multimillionaire that way. And so when you look at this sort of lineup for all of these government officials, the reason that people are so angry about corruption in China is that it's not just that everybody's a little corrupt and you have to pay small amounts of money in order to get things done. It's that you don't have to work very hard if you're born to somebody who is a government official. And so if you're a powerful government official, your children, your spouse, all have these great jobs, and you just generate this wealth generation after generation. So because the party and corruption are so closely intertwined, this actually creates a problem for the party, because every time somebody gets angry about corruption, so somebody's son who gets arrested and has, 10 sports cars and he's 19 years old, people don't just get angry about that and say, look at that corruption. They say, that's the party that's doing that. And that's not a good association that any party would want to have. And so what Xi Jinping wanted to do was to confront this. One of the really famous cases that happened right before he took office was this young man was driving his girlfriend back to her college campus, and he was speeding on campus driving a sports car, and he hit 2 other students. He killed one and injured the other, and then just kept driving and dropped his girlfriend off at her dorm, walked her up, and when he came down to his car, he had been surrounded by a mob of college students who had seen what happened, and they tried to prevent him from fleeing the scene. Rather than saying, I didn't do it, it was an accident, can I have a lawyer, he kept shouting, my father is Li Gong, who was the head of the Provincial Public Security Bureau. So basically the head of the police force for the entire province. And so people caught this on their cell phones and played this online. And what made everyone so angry is that he didn't care that he had just killed a young college student, 19 years old. All he cared about was that he expected that he should be able to walk free because of who his father was. So this is the kind of corruption that makes people very, very angry in China. It's more than just being asked to pay a bribe or knowing that a local government official is corrupt. It's the idea that power and corruption are endemic to the party. So this is what Xi Jinping is up against, right? And this is a really difficult challenge. There were a number of these cases that happened in the years before he took office. In China, these are called human flesh search engines, which is just a direct translation. But basically, one of the cases, and there are lots of different cases, is that netizens will find pictures of local government officials that they think are corrupt. They'll take pictures of all the luxury goods that they can find them with during public appearances. Then they will tally up what that total is and then tell you what that person's public publicly listed wages. This man was called Mr. Watch, and he had a wristwatch collection of, I don't know, 20 or 30 watches. I can't remember how many he was caught with, and they were all very, very expensive. So you can see in a public speech down in the corner, he's giving a speech with one of these watches. Well, the netizens, they found all of these watches and they calculated how much they cost. You can see when he was arrested a couple months later that he has a nice white spot and no watch. And so these campaigns, you saw them with wives of different local government officials with expensive handbags. There were all these different campaigns, but basically these are netizens trying to show that these local government officials, in this case down here, he's giving a speech at the site of a disaster. It was like a train derailment, wearing this watch. And so what people are saying is, you know, you're telling people that they've lost their loved ones because the government, you know, bought secondhand materials that weren't good and had structural weaknesses, and now they've lost their family, while you were wearing the wristwatch that you bought from, you know, the sale of those materials. And so this is the corruption cases then that Xi Jinping is facing, and it's really difficult because in order to really attack corruption, you have to attack the party. Right? There's no way to pull those things apart. And so what he did was he created what he called the Strike Hard campaign. And you can see with the graphic on the side, there were a lot of rules that he passed, basically where he told local government officials that they couldn't go out and eat in public restaurants while paying for them with taxpayer dollars. They couldn't have banquets. They couldn't drive flashy cars. So they couldn't do any of these things. And then they also started these investigations inside of the party. So the party has its own apparatus called the Central Discipline Committee. That apparatus started investigating all government officials that it received tips about. And so people could call in and report if they were being asked for bribes, and the party would then go and do an investigation. And then if they found evidence, they would turn these cases over to the courts. What's so interesting about this, because we've seen these kind of anti-corruption campaigns. Almost every government official does them when they take power. What was so different about this one is how extensive it was. So it started in 2013, right after he took power, and it's still going today. So it's really long lasting. It also targeted not only junior people, which is what we normally see, but it targeted people who were very, very senior. So for example, this is Zhou Yongkang, who was very, very powerful in China. So you can see if you look at his titles listed on the other side that he was actually on the Politburo Standing Committee. This is that group of 7 men who are the most powerful people in China. These are the people who rule China. The idea that one of their retired members could be investigated and he was later jailed for life on a corruption charge was just unheard of. So normally in China, in the corruption cases, you go after younger people, part of maybe a patronage network, like you can see his patronage network here, as a way to send a warning to somebody. But you never go after people in the military, you never go after high-ranking people or people who are retired. And what Xi Jinping has done is he's gone after all of those people in really large numbers. And so he's sending some kind of a signal here, a signal that most local government officials take to mean that he's very serious about this, that this is not a campaign to get rid of a few political rivals and then business as usual, but that he's really serious about eradicating corruption. However, this is all done inside the party. He's not creating an anti-corruption commission through the judiciary branch. He's not strengthening the judiciary branch or making it more independent. This is the party rooting out its own sources of weakness. So it's all in-house, right? So this is one of his responses, has been this anti-corruption campaign. And people say, okay, this is a really large campaign, what does he want? Oh, this is not going through, it's okay. So one thing is easy, right? Just fight corruption, that's okay. The other is target political rivals, which is what we've seen in the past. The problem is that if he's doing these things, targeting anti-corruption or targeting corruption, you would expect that he might create some sort of legal response to this, and he's not doing that. He also doesn't seem to be targeting political rivals in that he's really taken down people, high-ranking people from all sorts of factions inside of China. He's not targeting one group, so it's really across the board. One thing that people are saying is that maybe the next phase of what he wants to do is he needs to tackle the economy, and so maybe the reason that he's targeting such powerful people and also targeting people inside of the state-owned enterprise sector is so that he can remove those vested interests that could stop him from completely transforming the state-owned enterprise sector and the military. So recently, he's basically completely reorganized the military, which had a lot of layoffs. And so you had a lot of people who were decommissioned who used to work for the military. That would have been really difficult with the generals still in place, but he had removed them all through these anti-corruption campaigns. So we'll see what happens in the future, but that's one argument, that maybe what he's doing is removing vested interests through this anti-corruption campaign. The other main response that he's had is this idea about re-centralization of political power. So basically what this means is that in China, you had the party, but you also had the state. So for the state, you would have ministries, right? Like the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so if you were in a local government office and you worked for the education part of the state, right? So you were in the Bureau of Education or you were a principal, you would report up to the Ministry of Education. You wouldn't really have anything to do with the party, right? So that's the way politics are supposed to work in China. The party's ultimately in charge, but you have a normal state apparatus that does, normal state things. It issues regulations, it makes sure everyone's enforcing them, it writes a budget, those sorts of normal day-to-day state tasks. Well, what Xi Jinping has done is he's taken that kind of power from the ministries and he's pulled it back inside of the party. So he's created these small party groups that sit over top of each one of the ministries. So for the ministry that oversaw the military, he's created the National Security Council, chaired by none other than Xi Jinping. He actually chairs about 18 of the 26 that he's created, which probably makes him the busiest person in the world, or as The Economist noted, the chairman of everything, right? So what he's done then, and he's also done this for the economy, so he's created this Economic Reform Commission inside of the party that now the NDRC, which used to be, this was the National Development and Reform Commission, this was the part of the state that creates like the 5-year plans and oversees the economy. What they do now is they report to this economic group, this economic leading group inside of the party. So what this means is instead of these state ministries or state departments creating their own strategic plan, their own budget, and then enforcing them, all of that power has been taken away from them, and they're basically enforcement agencies. So the party writes the 5-year plan. The party then determines budgetary needs or other sorts of needs, and then they pass back responsibility to the state only to implement. And so this is this re-centralization of political power that we've seen, where instead of having a lot of different agencies, a lot of different actors, and then also power at the local government, he's tried to pull power from the local government, from the state, from the military, and re-centralize it all inside of the party. Which, if you're concerned about the party not being very important and being sort of invisible, that's no longer much of a fear, right? The party is now very visible and very powerful. And so if you are a young person who's graduating from college and you want to have a high-ranking position in any part of China other than a foreign multinational, you should be a party member. That would be a good career choice for you. But 5 years ago, that was not true. It was really not necessary, and most people chose not to become party members. Or they decided, if I ever need it for my career, I'll join the party later. Now that has changed. So this is what we see then. The latest re-centralization of political power, this has been extensively written about in the news, so you've probably seen lots of articles about this, but basically what we see is that we had term limits and we also had a retirement age in China. And Deng Xiaoping put this into place when he took power. So after Mao Zedong died, after the Cultural Revolution, and Deng Xiaoping took power, he thought, how can we keep the party and only the party, but also make sure that nobody as powerful as Mao Zedong can ever take power and do all sorts of crazy things that he dreamed up and no one could stop him from doing. And so he came up with this idea about, let's create term limits. So a president in China is very powerful because remember, he's the president, the general party secretary, the commander-in-chief, but he's term limited. The most he can serve are two terms of 5 years each, so 10 years total, right? After that, he's gone. There's also a retirement age, which says by the age of 67, all government officials cannot receive another promotion. So they can finish out their term, but they can't move on to another position. And then at the end of whatever their term is, they retire. So for most of them, they retire about 72, 73. This has been the norm then since the 80s. What we see is that Xi Jinping recently changed the constitution in China and he got rid of term limits. So there are no longer term limits for the president, which means that really powerful position in China of the president, the general party secretary, the head of the military, that's going to be a difficult position to move somebody out of until that person says they want to move out of it, right? So without a term limit, you basically have to have somebody say, I want to give up all the power. And unfortunately, we don't tend to see that all that often. So this is what we saw. And the reason that a lot of people are very concerned about it, I mean, one is the question about Xi Jinping himself. So is he good for China? Is he bad for China? This becomes an increasingly important question when he could be, I mean, he's only in his 60s right now. He could be the president for 20, 30 years, right? So he could be the president for a very long time. Before, when he was undertaking a lot of his controversial actions or policies, people said, well, he's entering his second term. 4 more years, he's gone. You know, whatever he does wrong, the next person can readjust. Now the stakes are a lot higher, right? So we don't know when he'll leave power. The other thing that people are very concerned about is, what does this mean for everyone else? So what we've seen in China is that if you have a single party, so in our country, we're lucky enough to have at least 2 parties, right? Two national parties. And so if you have a lot of ambition and you're frustrated in one party, you can switch parties, right? So there are ways that you can still climb the ladder to the top. If you only have a single party, what that means is that anyone in your country who has political ambition, you need to path them through one party. So what you'll see in China is that, and the worst thing that you could do is take somebody who has a lot of political ambition and is good at politics and keep them out of the party. Because those are the people who become revolutionaries, those are the people who start their own parties, they cause you a lot of headaches. So what you want is that anyone with political ambition, you keep inside the party. And so what China's had to do, it's a big country with a lot of people, is they've had to create a lot of smaller positions. So if you ever go to a Chinese city and somebody gives you their business card and they say that they're a vice mayor, what you have to ask is, how many vice mayors are there? Usually every major city has at least 12. Do they need 12 vice mayors? And that there are deputy mayors too. That vice mayor is not where it stops. And so what you tend to see then is that every level in the Chinese bureaucracy is staffed by a lot of people. And this is so they can constantly promote people and constantly meet their ambition inside of the party. And that's worked very well when you had a mandatory retirement age, right? So you could then take all of your government officials and you could guarantee that you had a certain number of spots at the top that were constantly open as you retired people. Well, now what Xi Jinping has done is he's gotten rid of term limits, but also one of his vice presidents who had been forced to retire, he brought back into government office, signaling that there's no longer a retirement age either. So what does this mean if you're 25 years old, you've just joined the party, you have a lot of political ambition? What you're seeing is that you probably are not making it out of your city. right? So if people aren't retiring at the top, the ones with the power, then you're basically, if you can get to mayor, you're pretty lucky. And all of a sudden, rather than competing against a certain group of people for a lot of positions, you're competing against the same number of people for just a couple positions. So what this has meant is that the stress levels for local government officials are really, really high. And for the first time since the 1980s, we've seen people voluntarily leaving government service. So for a long time, people wouldn't leave government service, so they would end up retiring, and that's because it was a great job with great benefits. Not a lot of other jobs in China have such great benefits, but people are voluntarily leaving because they can see their future, and it's one step ahead of right where they are right now. And so in a lot of the surveys that I've been doing with local government officials, we ask them, do you know where your career is going to end? Most of these government officials are in their early 30s, and we had about a 60% rate that said, yes, I think I know where my career is going to end, which is a little high, but not too worrisome, right? Now what we're seeing is that 85% of them are saying that they know where their career is going to end, and this is only going to get worse. And so the problem then that we see is that, are these people going to simply say, okay, I'm perfectly happy with spending my whole career in 2 jobs? Or are people going to say, we need to put pressure on Xi Jinping to push him out of office? And this is where things get dangerous. If you have a one-party system that doesn't have any way for leaders to advance, this is when you start to see coup attempts, you start to see revolution, you start to see a lot of unhappy people with political resources. And so from the perspective of a political scientist who studies Chinese institutions, I find this very concerning. Xi Jinping himself, as I told you with some of my stories, he does some good things, he does some bad things. All in all, I don't think that he's horrible or that he's going to do horrible things to China. I don't picture a cultural revolution or a great leap forward, right? I don't think that he is in fact Mao Zedong. The problem is that as time goes on, it's really hard to see in this type of system if anyone will tell him that decisions are bad ones, and so maybe he means to put in place a good decision. It has all these bad consequences and no one can tell him about these bad consequences. Or you start to see political factions splitting off and talking about coup attempts or other sorts of non-violent or violent ways to transition power. China's been really lucky in that they're not a democracy, but they've had peaceful transitions of power ever since Mao Zedong died. That's a great record, and that's something that I'm worried that they might be in danger of losing. So Xi Jinping has, of course, a different take on this. So I just want to give you his take versus only my own so you can hear the more positive side behind this story. So again, I want you to draw your own conclusions. And so what he says is, he says basically, look, the other part of my role is the party, so I'm the general party secretary. And it doesn't have a retirement age, it doesn't have term limits, and so all I'm doing is bringing these roles into alignment so that you don't have the case where I stay as the general party secretary but pass the presidency off to whoever's next, and then you have a split in power. And this has happened one time before. So when Jiang Zemin was retiring and passing power to Hu Jintao, he gave him first just the presidency, then he gave him general party secretary, but he held on to the military position, the head of the military, for about a year or two into Hu Jintao's presidency. And that's a very destabilizing thing, to have a different commander-in-chief than a president, right? So this is one thing that Xi Jinping points to. I don't know if you buy this. I don't really, but this is one thing that he argues. The other thing that he argues, and he might have a better case here, is that because corruption is so endemic to the party, you need somebody at the top who's not afraid of anyone else who can fight this fight against corruption. So his argument is if he passes it off to somebody who's the head of an anti-corruption commission, this person will just basically be, taken out of power or basically scared into not not pursuing some of these cases. If you have the guy at the top who's fighting an anti-corruption campaign, he's not afraid of anyone, right? So he can basically pursue all leads. He could take down anyone, including the vice president or the premier. So that's his argument. And the same thing about reforming the economy, that you need somebody with a lot of power if they're going to basically take on all of the vested interests that have been growing in the Chinese economy and really fundamentally transform it. So that's his argument. And then the other argument that he has is that there are a lot of foreign policy challenges facing China right now. North Korea is one of them. There's also Taiwan and reunification with Taiwan. So there are all of these foreign policy challenges, and Xi Jinping argues that we need continuity, that otherwise North Korea won't listen to China. They'll just wait for the 4 years to end so that there's a new president in place. And instead, if North Korea is going to know that Xi Jinping and China are serious, you need the same person to stay in power. They have to take what he says seriously because there's no one else. There's no one on the horizon, right? So these are his arguments, and I don't know if you buy them or not. We can talk about that, but that's what he says. This is why he says that he abolished the term limits. Okay, and so one argument is that that this is one of the memes that was going around social media in China, is that really he just loves power, right? And so the reason that they use Pooh is that well, the pictures I have up here of Xi Jinping, you can't see him sort of in a full body walking. It's only headshots, but he's a little bit rotund around the middle, and he likes to wear red. And so in Chinese social media, since they can't criticize Xi Jinping directly, they usually depict him as Winnie the Pooh. And so they call him Winnie the Pooh or Pooh Bear, and they basically, this is a criticism of him saying he abolished term limits because he loves power. So find the thing you love and stick with it. And so that's one of the arguments. These aren't coming up here, but it's okay. And so the other argument is that he basically is trying to take on these vested interests inside of China. And some of these people are the people that we would think about as the Deng Xiaoping elites. So these are people in China who have been talking for a long time that China needs rule of law. So these are sometimes called the constitutionalists in the Chinese context, and these are the people who argue, like Deng Xiaoping did, that it's okay if you're not a democracy, it's okay if you have a single party, as long as you have really strong, regular rules to govern everything, that you can be a well-functioning country. Deng Xiaoping argued that democracy is not the secret of countries like the United States, it's the fact that we have a strong legal system and we have rules regulating everything, and that they're enforced. So this was Deng's argument, and so that's why he created term limits and put them in the Constitution. He created a whole series of rules inside of the party, and he also created the first court system that we saw in China. And so you have a group of elites in China who believe this. They believe we don't have to democratize, but we do have to have rule of law, and it has to apply to everyone all the time. So this group of people have basically seen, a lot of them have been rounded up through the AntiCorruption Campaign, but a lot of them also reside in civil society, which is the area that I study. They run a lot of think tanks and nonprofits that advocate constitutionalism, rule of law, legal reform in China. And a lot of these people are, if they're not under house arrest, they're being watched, and they've had to shut down their organizations. Most of them, ironically, have actually been put in jail on tax fraud. Because running a think tank or a civil society group in China, it's not illegal, but it's not exactly legal. You don't have any sort of legal entity for an organization. And so if you're the founder of an organization, you are liable legally for this organization. So if people give you donations or you collect money, you're supposed to report that on your taxes as income, even though it's for your association. So this is an easy thing to catch people on. You might remember Ai Weiwei, the famous artist. This is the charge they leveled against him too, for tax fraud, because he has a foundation. And so this is a common legal challenge then that a lot of people end up facing, which is true, but also it's convenient. So this is one group that he might be fighting against, which is to say that China doesn't need rule of law, it can have rule by law, which means that Xi Jinping sets the law, enforces it on everyone else, and that this is going to be a substitute for rule of law. So that's an open question. So if you have somebody at the top who has very strong beliefs and is going to really enforce them through anti-corruption campaigns and re-centralizing political power, if he's the chairman of everything, can he really enforce his will in all parts of China at all times? Can he reform the economy? Can he get people not to engage in corruption? Can he clean up the environment? And so this is the gamble that he's taking. He thinks he can. And so he's going head to head with this group of elites who say, no one person can do this. We need rules and we need consequences and we need courts. And then he also is basically taking away a mobilization point for any other faction inside of the government. So whenever you have a term limit, you have a point at which people can rally. So people tend to get tired, right? So if you're fighting a resistance movement against somebody who's in power, this takes a lot of energy and it's exhausting. If you know when that person's term ends, it's easy to keep people energized for a couple of years. If they're just going to be in power forever, then for a lot of people, they no longer really want to mobilize, right? This guy's in power forever and I have my life to live. And so what you tend to see is that this demobilizes everybody except the very committed. So this is something that he's thinking about. And he's also sending a message to people who have created memes like this. He's not too fond of these. And he's basically saying that he's going to take back the internet and that the internet is not there to mock him or expose corruption or do any of these other things. It's just there for business. So if you're using it for business, great. If you're using it to unearth corruption or poke fun at the government, that's not okay. So there's been a whole series of laws that have been passed about basically if you post something, even though you're posting to your friends and family, if other people repost it a certain number of times, you can go to jail. And we've already had the first couple of cases of people who came up with funny memes or had funny poems that then were reposted, and those people have gone to jail. Also, if you post something that's directly criticizing the government, they can bring you in for questioning and you could potentially go to jail. So these are pretty draconian laws that we haven't seen in China for a long time. The previous administration said this is a release valve, like let people come up with Winnie the Pooh. Does this really hurt you if you're Xi Jinping and one of the most powerful people in the world? If people are looking at their phones and laughing because you look like Winnie the Pooh? It's probably not a huge concern, right? And so it's interesting that he finds this to be something that he wants to fight against, right? It might show you that there's a lot more unrest in China that we know about, which is what a lot of the people that I talk to in China who are political scientists in China are saying, which is that they have to be very careful right now because all of these rules that look that Xi Jinping has control over so many aspects of the government, society, the market, actually in a lot of these areas, because he's taken such tight control, people are very angry, and that people who used to ignore politics feel that they're personally being impacted, and that there's actually a lot of unrest, and this is something that the government's very concerned about. So you see that the government is cracking down on things that they used to just think were, you know, release valves, right? People letting off a little steam. And then some of the consequences then we've talked about. So one thing that we might see is that we might see that there is economic reform. So Xi Jinping might be right. You might actually have to get rid of all of these rich and powerful people who are making their money through the economy looking like one thing in order to transform it to something else. And so for those of you who were economics majors, if you think about partial reform, right, when countries start to reform their economy, but people who are being impacted try to stop that so that they can maintain their position of power in society. This is something then that he's concerned about, which is that China got rid of most of their state-owned enterprises by the 1990s. They only have about 157, 156 left, but all of these are intensely powerful. They have about 50% of all of the assets of the entire Chinese economy. So there's not very many of them, but they're really powerful. And so what Xi Jinping might be trying to do is removing those people with such power and then reforming state-owned enterprises. So he's trying to put budget constraints on state-owned enterprises, and he's also trying to get them to remit more and more of their profits in the form of taxes. We also see that one potential consequence, this is something that I'm very concerned about, that I talked to you about, is this idea of elite fragmentation, right? That people who have a lot of ambition but see that that's going to be frustrated might be willing to start talking about creating a new party, or if not that radical, maybe a faction inside of the party that will find a way to try to push Xi Jinping out of power. So we might see that. If this gets really bad, we might see a lot more government surveillance, which we're already starting to see a lot of through the new social credit system, which I can talk more about in Q&A. We might even see coup attempts, although I think we're a fair distance away from that. But, you know, every time I think about making a statement like that, I think about my colleagues who studied the Soviet Union in 1989 who said it's stable, right? So I don't want to make any predictions. Right now, we don't see rumblings of coup attempts, but that could potentially happen. We definitely see already less responsive government. So local government in China is no longer responding to citizens who are grumbling. So if citizens used to grumble a lot about a new law that was being passed, a lot of local government officials would stop implementing it and say, let's just wait for a little bit. Now, because they're being watched by the central government and they don't want to get caught up in an anti-corruption campaign, they're implementing every single law that comes through, regardless of how it's impacting local communities. So you don't see much responsiveness. Citizens are saying that local government officials who used to listen to them are saying, I have to do what my boss tells me. And then we do see economic reform starting, but this type of economic reform looks a certain way. This is the brainchild of Xi Jinping and what he thinks needs to happen. This is not what we're seeing in places like Wenzhou, where we see a lot of private enterprise. So Xi Jinping is saying these are areas where you can develop. So if you want to be an electric car manufacturer or create electric car batteries or do something with blockchain or AI, then the government will subsidize you. But if you want to do something that the government's not paying attention to, it's unlikely that you'll get a business license. And so the difficulty with economic reform is that he has the power to push through reform, but it's a very centralized idea. Think about like 5-year, 10-year plans, that kind of a mindset, versus simply freeing market forces to see what develops over time and what's successful. So I think we'll see economic reform. I don't know how successful it will be. It depends if Xi Jinping makes good picks. So is blockchain the next big thing? If so, then they might do well. If not, then they won't do as well. So these are some of the concerns then. And then for international consequences, for those of you who've been watching the trade war, one thing then that you'll want to think about is that in the past, China would never have engaged in a trade war with the United States. This is because they needed the United States as a market in order to maintain their growth. That is no longer the case. So after 2008 and 2009, they diversified their markets because they were basically importing our financial crisis. So they expanded to Europe, and that was kind of bad because next came the Eurozone crisis. But then they also created really large, flourishing markets in Latin America as well, and the rest of Asia. And so what we see for China right now is that the US is a big part of their market, but they have lots of other markets around the world. So they can go ahead and sustain a trade war with the United States depending on certain things. The other thing to remember is that Hu Jintao was a cautious bureaucrat. He was somebody who came to the top through lots of different government positions and by not making any enemies. He was simply the least objectionable person. No one liked him, but no one disliked him. That's one way to make it to the top, right? Xi Jinping is not this person. Xi Jinping obviously felt very comfortable just changing the Constitution and getting rid of term limits. This is somebody who feels very strongly, and when his mind is made up, he's willing to go ahead with very aggressive moves. So as we've seen in the South China Sea, when he decides that something is part of his policy, he's willing to back it regardless of the consequences. And so in this idea of a trade war with the United States, I think the U.S. Trade Representative's office had given good advice, which is that China's always backed down whenever we've threatened a trade war. And I think that that's what they thought would happen. And I think that they're really shocked that China's not stepping back, but also escalating. And so this is something that I would expect more of. I don't expect Xi Jinping to walk it back. I expect that if President Trump wants to negotiate, that Xi Jinping will meet him and will talk conditions, but he won't respond to threats. And he doesn't need to. He's not in that position anymore. So this is somebody who's very powerful and has a certain vision of the future and where he wants to go. And that's who's leading China today, which is very different from a lot of the bureaucrats that we've seen in the past. So I'll go ahead and stop there and take questions. And I'm happy, I teach political science, but I have to teach all of our courses about Chinese foreign policy and Chinese politics. So your questions can be about any of these topics, but I'm happy to take anything. Yeah.
What is his intent with Hong Kong?
So with Hong Kong, it's difficult to tell. I think the stated assumption of one country, two systems is still in play, as long as Hong Kong doesn't push it too far. So one thing that China's worried about, and I don't know if this is a focus as much of Xi Jinping's as it is the rest of the Politburo, but one thing that they're very concerned about is having a lot of young representatives from the Umbrella Revolution, the social protest movement that they had in Hong Kong, having those people elected into office and starting to create an alliance with the Democrats. And so that those young progressives and the Democrats forming this alliance, these are the groups that talk about how they won't say, they won't sing the Chinese anthem, they won't fly the Chinese flag. So that group he's definitely worried about, and he doesn't want them to become more powerful. As long as Hong Kong focuses on the market and not on politics, I think that the mainland is perfectly happy allowing them to keep their system. But if they become more political and they try to push back against Chinese rule, then I would expect that China would exert more and more force.
And I also hear Singapore, that they're now becoming more active in Singaporean politics.
Yeah, China's always been active there, but China has a love affair with Singapore. They love everything about Singapore. They would love to be Singapore. And I always think it's funny because, it's such a small country to think as China, like this is our model. It would be like us looking at, I don't know, Hong Kong and saying that's a good model for all of the United States. But you see that there's a lot of exchanges. So government officials go back and forth between Singapore and the mainland. You also see people who work at think tanks and who are professors. So there are a lot of jointly hosted conferences. So there's a lot of communication between the two. So China's been really active in Singapore for a while, but usually from a position more as a student or somebody learning. So I haven't seen them trying to play like a power broker role. Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit more about the Dengist group and the think tanks who are looking at the rule of law? Is there a set of principles, a constitution or something, or behind that would give direction to what the rule of law should be? And to what degree does the Singapore model play a role in this whole thing?
Exactly, yeah. So that group of people, they love Singapore too. So it's this idea that you create a set of laws. Maybe you get it right with the laws, maybe you don't. They don't think it really matters all that much as long as you have laws that are written down that everybody can see and that are regularly enforced. That's what they think is really important. It's the certainty. So it's a very economic vision of institutions that basically, as long as people know what the rules are, they'll adapt around those rules, but they have to know for sure what those rules are. And so they want to see those in politics as well as in economics. And so they would like to see, for example, that the party itself writes party rules that are publicly available to everyone, and that there isn't this veil of secrecy around the party. So if you ask a regular Chinese citizen, how was Xi Jinping picked when he first became president, they have no idea. They might give you some guesses, but no one knows. So, and oftentimes party members don't know either. So there's a lot of secrecy, and this group, what they would like to see is that that veil of secrecy is pulled back and everything is regularized. So all the rules are laid out for everyone to see, and they're all enforced for everyone. So their idea would be that you wouldn't have corruption anymore, because it doesn't matter if you're the head of provincial public security bureau. If your son runs over a college student, he's going to stand trial for manslaughter, right? It doesn't matter who your parent is. And so that would be what they would argue, is that the only vision I think that they all have in common is that all of the rules for politics, for economics, are written down and enforced. And so I think they would argue that you need a powerful, independent judiciary for that, but they don't seem to have a common set of what those rules look like. I think there are preferences, but
Singapore is then a model for it.
Exactly, right. So if you want to have a published rule for, not chewing gum, we might think that seems kind of silly, but from that perspective, it doesn't matter what the rule is as long as everyone knows about it and it's enforced, right? So that's what they think. Yeah.
Without intending to, perhaps, you have explained very succinctly why our president admires Xi Jinping. Mm-hmm. Question. You mentioned that there are now an effort to get rid of corruption. What are the penalties? Mm-hmm. Do they go to jail? Do they get disappear?
It's actually the death penalty. So China has the death penalty as a consequence for a fair number of crimes. They've done a better job at getting rid of some of the easier ones, but it could be things like theft would also have a death penalty. So corruption at that level does carry a death penalty. We haven't seen, though, that anyone has been given the death penalty, or even if they've been given the death penalty, it's been commuted to lifetime in prison. So that's what we've seen so far, is that all of the bigger cases are lifetime in prison. Some of the smaller cases are a certain amount of time in prison followed by house arrest. So that's mainly what we're seeing so far. And of course your property is seized, right? So I see a hand here and then over here. Yeah.
What would you see happening with Taiwan over the next 50 years?
That's a really good question. Yes. So this is a question about Taiwan and what's going to happen over the next 50 years. So Xi Jinping has said that by 2020, which is, I think it's the 100th anniversary of the party, that he would like to see that, that Taiwan rejoins the mainland, that's his goal. But he has formalized in a document that by 2050, Taiwan will rejoin the mainland. So he seems to be in much stronger terms than I think we've ever heard any government official after Mao Zedong talk about this. He seems to be very focused on reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. So he seems to think that that's going to happen. I think that reunification is further away than it's ever been. So I happened to be in Taiwan for a conference, and we were, I was the youngest person there. Everyone else was much more senior than I was. And so we were on this sort of study tour, and we were actually meeting with the president. And so we're sitting around, you've probably seen the pictures where you sit in those overstuffed armchairs. So we're sitting in a circle in the armchairs with our cup of tea and talking to the president of Taiwan, and he's talking to us about the trade deal that they had recently signed with the mainland, and about how good he thinks it's going to be for the youth, because there was high youth unemployment in Taiwan at that time, and it was a services deal, and he thought that this would be really good for all these people who were graduating. And at one point, everybody's phone started going crazy, and so everyone in the circle started checking their phones and whispering to each other, and I, of course, have a really old phone, and so it wasn't doing anything, and I had no idea what was going on. But one of President Ma's aides ran to him and whispered in his ear, and he threw his cup of tea down and stood up and said, "It's been a pleasure meeting you," and walked out. And that was because that was the Sunflower Revolution, and the students had just taken the parliament. They had just stormed the parliament and taken it over. And so I unintentionally was there during this sunflower revolution, and so I went to the protests and I talked to a lot of the students, and what they were saying is that they felt that all of these economic deals were tying Taiwan to China, the mainland's economy, in such a way that they wouldn't need a democratic vote to actually talk about reunification, and that Taiwan was a democracy and everybody had a vote, and it should be a vote and not just some de facto arrangement after the economies were brought very close together. So President Ma lost the next election, his party lost the next election, and you have the Democratic Party's candidate who's currently the president. So one thing that I saw, though, with a lot of those youth is that they didn't want reunification. They didn't even want a closer economy, even if it meant jobs for them, that they felt that they were losing their identity and that Taiwan should, you know, be an independent country. So in the opinion polling that we've seen since then, in the last couple of years, we've seen a huge shift. So the opinion polling, they ask the same question all the time. It says, do you see your identity as Chinese first, Taiwanese second, Taiwanese first and Chinese second, and then they have sort of an indigenous Taiwanese category. And what we always used to see is that the majority of the population would say Chinese first, Taiwanese second, and then you had a certain amount of people who said indigenous Taiwanese. What we've seen now is that that dynamic has shifted, and the majority of people in Taiwan are saying that they view themselves as Taiwanese first and Chinese second. And when we look at the demographic information, we see that basically people 35 and younger are almost exclusively identifying as Taiwanese first. So what we're seeing then is, as this new population reaches voting age, you see more and more sentiment for candidates who will take a hard line and say we don't want reunification, which means that a lot of the peaceful methods for reunification are probably politically off the table. So if Taiwan wasn't a democracy, there might be some other pathways there, but if you're a political candidate talking about reunification, you will lose. So what does that mean? Well, it means that it's going to be really, really difficult to see a peaceful path for reunification. So, you know, in the absence of some big shock to Taiwan, like something where there's a huge natural disaster or their economy is, you know, really damaged, I don't necessarily know if people would willingly want to reunify with the mainland. So that's something that I think is really challenging. And so for the US, with our security guarantee with Taiwan, this is going to be something we have to watch very closely, because Xi Jinping has said it will happen by 2050. And if it doesn't happen, he will make it happen. And he might be president in 2050. So I agree with you. I think that in the past, when I would get that question, I would say, oh, they're getting closer and closer. There's so many, you know, channels for possible peaceful reunification, but I see most of those channels closing, and that makes me a little worried. Yeah.
What you're saying, Xi Jinping is like sort of a benevolent dictator. Trump would like to be a dictator. Where do you see the trade war going?
Yeah, so as far as the trade war, I think that my hope is that President Trump doesn't seem ideologically committed to very many things. You know, maybe Russia aside, I'm not so sure about that. But for most things, it seems that if he has a great deal of negative press, especially people that he considers in his base who are getting hurt, that he will pretty easily walk it back. He doesn't seem that he's ideologically committed to something, and even if people are really angry, that he wouldn't consider reversing it. So I think that as you see things like Harley-Davidson moving abroad, you're going to continue seeing things like that. The soybeans, the farmers who are no longer able to export their soybeans, you can only buy them off with subsidies for so long. At some point, this is going to become a really difficult thing. I think when those people start complaining loudly and vocally and saying, I'm not going to vote for you in the next election, I think he'll walk it back at that point. And then I think he'll, you know, until then, I think he'll make small exceptions as he needs to avoid some of the worst consequences like we saw with ZTE. So that's what I think will happen. But I don't think it will be China that walks it back. And in the past, I would have always said that China will be the one to solve this. Yeah. Yep. Do we have time for another? Okay, good.
What's the actual relationship between North Korea and China?
Yeah, it's a really tense one. you know, when they talk about it rhetorically, of course, China's the, depending on who's talking about it, either the big brother to the little brother or the uncle to the nephew. And there's this idea that they have a really close relationship. But I think that unless you're talking to government officials or military personnel who were active in the 1950s, pretty much any other generation of Chinese view North Korea really as a liability. So especially if you talk to people in the northeastern part of China, what they're saying pretty publicly is, look, this crazy guy has these weapons and we don't want to be the casualty when he, you know, blows something up, because for northeastern China, they're right there. And so they're very concerned about this, and the government is very concerned about this too. So I mean, publicly they still talk about younger brother, older brother, uncle, nephew relationship, this close relationship that they've had, but they also have been exerting a lot of pressure. The problem for China is that they had a good relationship with the grandfather. They had a good relationship, a fairly good relationship with the father. And they actually thought that, that the father would implement some sort of economic reform that looked kind of like China's. He created a couple special economic zones, and he said he was going to start to reform the North Korean economy. You probably remember that in the 90s when he created like some free market zones and things like that. And so China felt like they could work with those administrations, and they weren't willing to take a very hard line. This recent administration, they don't feel that they can work with. I mean, he's very paranoid. So everyone, if you look at the photo of his father's funeral, everyone who was a pallbearer is dead. Most of his family members are dead, not by accident, right? He's killed them all. And so this is somebody who, he doesn't have a lot of people who are close to China that they can rely on to talk to him, and he doesn't talk directly to China a lot either. So they don't have a lot of good connections or good ways to talk to him. They don't also feel that they can really negotiate that hard with them. So they do the same things that they used to do, where they'll cut off their oil shipments, they'll cut off their food shipments for a certain amount of time. But the problem that China's dealing with is that they share a land boundary with North Korea. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but in some places, I mean, I guess there's a line. You know, the tours I've been on, they tell us where the line is so we don't accidentally step across it. But it's really, once you're away from the Yalu River in the middle and you're north of that border, I can't tell the difference. I can't tell where China ends and North Korea starts. Now, they tell me that if you take a wrong step, the guards will pop up out of these bunkers they've built underground and you'll see them. But I can't see where the boundary is. So what China's worried about is that if they push really hard, they might collapse the regime. And if they do that, they're on the front lines not only of all of these starving refugees flooding across the border, but also all of that nuclear weapons technology that they think the military will grab and try to take across the border to Pakistan, Kazakhstan, you know, some of these other places and sell. And so what they're very concerned about is that they'll have unsecured nuclear technology on their soil, chemical weapons, which we know he has, and that these things will all be destined for the black market, but they have to transit through China first. And then also you'll have these refugees. And so that's something then that they're concerned about. And so they're willing to push, but they're not willing to push so hard that they risk a collapse. And so what you tend to see is you tend to see pressure and then North Korea willing to do something, and then China immediately relieves that pressure. So as far as what China's willing to do in the future, I don't think they're willing to do much more than that. I think that they were probably having conversations with their contacts in the military about who might be next in rule in case something happened to Kim Jong-un, whether it was deliberately something happened to him or something else, which is, I think, why he's killing off his uncle, his aunt, his nephews, his brother. So I think that's why he's removing all of those people, is that I think he thinks that China does, that they do want Plan B, right? That they don't think that he's a good faith negotiator. So it's a difficult situation, and I don't see it really, I see the same thing going on, this sort of, we'll stop our aid until you agree to something, and then we'll put it back on the table. And Kim Jong-un knows this as well. He knows that the Chinese are more afraid of what will come over the border than they are of him. So in that situation, I don't know what bargaining power you have. Yeah.
Could you shed a little light on the taxation system in China? How does the central government get money?
Yeah. So they have a income tax, and that's their primary means for gathering revenue. But they also tax businesses, and for state-owned enterprises, it's hard to describe it exactly as a tax. It's sort of, I mean, they're part of the government. So they just kind of reach in and take what they need. So those are their main sources of revenue. So through state-owned enterprises, they get foreign dollars. Also, the banks are all state-owned. So through those state-owned enterprises, they bring in a lot of revenue. Then they also bring in revenue through income taxes, but in 2006 they created a sort of a bottom of the income tax bracket. So if you make below a certain amount, you don't have to pay any taxes. And so that's mostly the way then that they earn their revenue. What they're trying to do, because they're worried about a property bubble, is they're also trying to create a property tax. I know, it's the Chinese Communist Party creating a property tax. It's a little funny, but they are. So what they're doing is they're creating new ideas of private property, including allowing farmers to sublease their land to these big agricultural companies. And so these are state-owned enterprises. And so as a farmer, you then sublease your land, you get a certain amount of money, and then the state-owned enterprise is the one that's going to pay taxes. And so especially in places like the Northeast, you see these huge farms forming. For people in the cities who are buying apartments, they then have to pay a property tax. So this is what they're trying to do, and this is the way that they see a way out of the property bubble that they have in China. So I don't know if you remember our property bubble in 2008, 2009, it was kind of like this big. And then I don't know if you remember in Japan, the property bubble that they had in the 90s that sort of caused their economy to go into stagnation forever until now. And it was a little bit bigger. The Chinese is up here at this point. And so what they're concerned about is that if you have a really large property bubble, how do you deflate it rather than pop it? And so taxation is the answer they've come up with. And so what they do is they have a graduated tax fee. If you buy an apartment and it's your first one and it's your primary residence, you just pay a small property tax. But it's tripled for you to buy a second apartment. And then it skyrockets after that. And they do the same thing with cars. So anything that they decide is sort of a luxury good, they're charging property taxes on. So that's what they're trying to do as a way of deflating this property bubble, but the money, instead of going to the central government, goes to the local governments. And this is trying to ease the debt burden on the local governments. So this is new. This is something that they're just starting to implement over the last year. Yeah.
Just a quick food question.
Yeah.
When you and other professors and dignitaries that you work with travel to China, do you eat and or served food that we'd be familiar with here, or do you eat food that is more appropriate in China?
Well, it depends what you mean by familiar. So McDonald's is a thriving enterprise in China.
Chinese food here
Yeah.
in China is probably nice. Yeah,
so some of the things that we eat here, you're served in China. I think if you went to southern China, you'd see a lot more familiar things on the menu. I tend to spend a lot of time in northern China and then western China, and so most of those things you don't usually see on the menu. Although I've heard that in New York City and in Boston, you can go to hot pot restaurants. So hot pot is really popular in China, and that's sort of like this big fondue thing, but with oil, right? And so you put in raw meats and vegetables. So that's really popular in China, and you can have that now in the US. If you go to a restaurant that serves dumplings, so not spring rolls, but dumplings, that's also very authentic. And so those are some great foods. Southern food, I'm not a huge fan of myself. Northern food and Western food is really spicy, and it also has a lot more noodles and breads than it does rice. So I would say that if you find a place that serves that kind of food, that would be a great thing to try. I think it will completely change what you think about Chinese food. Yeah.
This is a little off the subject, but what is that population control that was in the past? How did that impact the economy, et cetera?
That's a really good question. So that large demographic change that we're seeing, that's not natural. Now it's partially natural, but it was driven for a long time by the one-child policy. So the reason that we see a smaller working age population and a really large graying population is because of the one-child policy. Now they've lifted it. So about 2 years ago, they said, okay, mission accomplished, right? We don't have a growing population. Please start to have more children. But now people don't want to have more children. So now you have these families living in big cities, and they're perfectly happy with one child. Some people are having two, but nobody really wants more than one or two. I mean, think about living in Beijing. It's like living in New York City, right? So the apartment prices are the same, the school prices are the same, there's no parking. So the idea of having a large, sprawling family with 3 or 4 children, nobody wants that. They're living the same way that people in other major cities all around the world are. Plus, women are working now. And so women are not staying home with children, they're working as well. And China doesn't, even though we think about them as, you know, a large socialist country, they don't have any sort of child care until your child goes into school. So if you are, so for example, I have lots of friends who have young children and they both work, and they have to bring their grandparents, the grandparents, in from wherever they live and try to force them to live in the child's bedroom, because these are small apartments. So the grandparents live in the child's bedroom and provide child care. They're only willing to do that for so long. And so what you tend to see then is that couples have one child. That's all they can afford. That's all they really want. And so even though they changed the policy a few years ago, the birth rate has continued to be about 1 child per couple. So that's a real problem for them. In the countryside, in rural areas, people do tend to have larger families, as I think we see in most countries. But the problem is in those places, they don't have very good education. So the idea that, you know, you're going to have your next generation of people working on blockchain and AI coming from, you know, rural places that don't have good sanitation and don't have good schools, that's not really going to happen. So what Xi Jinping is trying to do right now is he's trying to bring people from the countryside into larger cities, not to the coast, but into whatever the larger city is next to them, so that he can make sure that everybody has good education and a good standard of living, because that's the next generation. I mean, they're, you know, just numbers, right? They're larger. And so for a while, that was a population that was really underserved with social services. And so that's a gap they're trying to address. But it's a really large challenge. If you imagine us talking about our social security system in the United States and how we might not be able to fund it past a certain number of years, imagine the population of China with, I think, what did they say? I think it's 40% of the population is basically going to need social security or pensions or health care. So you have this huge population and you have a very small working age population, and you don't have any sort of publicly funded social security system. So again, that's a really large challenge. Yeah.
How do you see this Silk Road Belt? I don't know the exact name.
The Belts and Roads Initiative, yes. So the Belts and Roads Initiative, this is a series of, they can be silk roads or silk belts or maritime belts. They have all these different ways of describing them. And if you look at the map, so there is a Belts and Roads Initiative website. And so if you want to look at the map and see the different initiatives, you can see these. This is basically Xi Jinping's development plan. So for inside of China, he has the Chinese dream. For outside of China, the rest of Asia, and then at some point the rest of the world, he has the Belts and Roads Initiative. And basically it focuses on infrastructure, which is probably a smart thing. That's definitely where the Chinese strength is. And so they've also created a development bank like our World Bank. They've created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I visited them this summer with a group of students, and now I know that they are called the AIIB. So if you want to impress people and be in the know, don't call them AIIB, they're AIIB. And this is a World Bank, basically, that funds infrastructure investment all around the world. And so basically what they're trying to do, think about it like a hub and spokes, where China is the hub, and they're trying to connect the rest of the world to them through these spokes. And so these spokes are, they're shipping lanes and creating ports ports for those, their oil and gas pipelines, their railroad tracks, their highways, whatever the way is to get from where you are to China. They're trying to connect every market in the world to China, with China as the center, and they're funding it. So for example, if there are oil pipelines coming from Pakistan across Kazakhstan and in through Xinjiang into China, there are ports that they built and then later purchased, like in Sri Lanka. So what they're doing basically is creating all of this infrastructure. Right now it's to link the rest of Asia to China, so China's the economic hub, but eventually you could imagine the whole world could be connected in that way. And so that's really their goal. And they think that, you know, as long as the Chinese economic engine is working, that everybody will do well. We haven't really seen that, though. It's really difficult. So the Chinese can build the infrastructure to the border, and they can build infrastructure from their side to the border. They haven't really been able to link over the borders yet, because they have to deal with tariffs and, you know, the migration of people and all sorts of really sticky questions that, you know, the EU is still dealing with, right? So this is also what China has to deal with. So I don't think it'll be successful for a while.
But yeah. I got the impression that they go out there, peddle these projects, and then the locals have to sign up, indebt themselves, then they go bankrupt, then the Chinese take over whatever they build and manage it as a foreign settlement.
Yeah, and so this is what happened in that port in Sri Lanka. I'm not exactly sure if that was the Chinese fault, in that other countries had bid to build the port as well. The Sri Lankan government is not the best managed government, so I don't necessarily know if that was their intention in the beginning. In most countries, what we tend to see is that they invest in the infrastructure, and if the country has a hard time paying them back, they seem pretty easy to negotiate. So they've done debt forgiveness in different countries. They've also said, you know, they've extended the repayment time and these sorts of things. Now, could they do that if they wanted and say, we built this, so we're going to take it? I guess, but you also have to have secure facilities. So if you create a railway if you build a railway for a country and then you try to repossess it, I don't know how secure that railway would be. So, you know, they've built a railway across Kenya, and they're trying to basically create a rail system that would go from all across Africa, east to west. So if you try to cross that many countries and you don't have government goodwill or people's goodwill, I don't know how successful they'll be. So they don't seem to have an appetite for becoming, you know, sort of neo-colonial conquerors and taking territory. The Sri Lankan case is the only one where we see that they've done that, and there were a lot of other circumstances. So it's something to keep your eye on and see, like, you know, does this become a pattern? So far, there's only been one case like that, and a lot of cases that look like the other thing that I described. So I would say just watch it and see over time. But it's sort of the argument that people make about the World Bank as well, right? Sort of this neo-colonial power coming in and building a dam, and this is what's going to happen, your community will be flooded. So, I mean, there will be claims like that, definitely. I guess you have to sort of see what the evidence says over time. But so far, I'm not seeing that they're using it as a tool like that. It really seems to be this idea that China can become the new world hub, right? Not the US, but China. And so they've also tried to internationalize their currency, and they've tried to undertake a number of steps to make this happen. Most of the people that I've talked to at the World Bank or at the IMF, I mean, they don't see this happening anytime soon. This is Xi Jinping's vision, maybe for 2050. I don't know when he thinks he'll realize it. But this is the plan that they've laid out, and they're working towards it. But like, I was in Yunnan province talking, they have a research center, a Belts and Roads Initiative research center, and I was looking at what the plans were as well as what's actually happened. And in Yunnan, which is supposed to be the hub for the rest of Southeast Asia because they share a land border, they haven't gotten any further than they did by 2006. So under Xi Jinping and all this extra investment, they've held 2 trade summits. That's the extent of it. So, you know, I think this is going to be a long road, and I don't know how successful they'll be at the end of the day.
And with that, we're going to have to.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.